Whenever Megamind is brought up for discussion in most circles, one thing that'll inevitably come up is how many similarities it has to another animated villain becoming the hero movie released the very same year, Despicable Me. And while they do most definitely have a lot of similarities, I believe there's another movie that Megamind shares quite a bit in common with that was also released around the same time, with that movie being Wreck-It Ralph. Now, you may think I'm crazy, as obviously that movie doesn't have nearly as much in common with Megamind as Despicable Me, even I'll admit that, but I still say that if you examine these two movies very closely, they do have more similarities than you'd think. And today, I'd like to go over what both these movies do and don't have in common with each other. But before we get into it, I'd just like to warn all of you that there will be spoilers for both movies ahead, so if you haven't seen either of them yet and you don't want anything ruined, you should probably click off the video and come back later. I will be giving out no other spoiler warnings here. Alright, so to get right into it, I guess the best place to start is with the premise of both movies, with Megamind's being that after finally defeating his superhero archenemy, the notorious supervillain Megamind finds himself without a purpose and decides to go out and create a new hero for him to fight and be defeated by. While in Wreck-It Ralph, a video game villain who's actually a nice guy becomes depressed after being treated like an outcast simply for doing his job and desires to find a new game where he can be the hero instead. Now, once again, at first glance these plot summaries don't sound all that similar to each other, but as I spoke about at length in my Hidden Brilliance of Megamind video, and you can find a link in the description to that in case you're curious, the character of Megamind actually has a lot in common with Wreck-It Ralph. He just plays the part of a villain and is actually a pretty good guy when you get to know him. The biggest difference between them mainly comes down to the fact that Megamind actively takes pride in being the bad guy and all the hatred it generates towards him from the populace, while Ralph never really had a choice in the matter and just wants the respect he rightfully deserves. He'd been an outcast for 30 years for the crime of just doing his job, and one he'd never asked for at that. But the similarities don't end there either, because once Megamind enters an undercover relationship with Roxanne, he begins to feel very similar to the way Ralph does. Bummed out over the fact that nobody will accept him, that he always has to be the villain no matter what, and that he'll never be appreciated for his more admirable qualities. Both movies even have virtually the same line, "I don't want to be the bad guy anymore," spoken at different points by Ralph and Megamind. And that line is also reflective of the fact that they're both at their lowest point after a lifetime of being beaten into the ground by others over things they had no control over. Though ironically, one of their biggest differences here is that Megamind actually gets to become a beloved hero in the end, while Ralph ends up remaining the villain of his game. Though he still basically gets what he had wanted anyway, as he still gets to become a hero and finally get the respect he had always deserved. But to get into some other characters from the two movies that are somewhat similar, there's also Roxanne and Sergeant Calhoun, very intelligent women who end up having the best grasp on the unfolding situations going on around them throughout their respective movies. Though the biggest difference here is that Roxanne is a deconstruction and somewhat possible reconstruction of the damsel in distress, while Calhoun is simply an action girl and no-nonsense leader. which also leads to the other biggest difference between them, as Roxanne's biggest contributions to the plot are usually through her intellect and growing feelings for Megamind, while Calhoun, because of the type of game she comes from and the kind of character she was programmed to be, is much more hands-on and in control of all the increasing chaos surrounding her. And they both also end up in a relationship with a major character that helps mend a broken spirit. Though in Roxanne's case, she's the one who helps Megamind come to terms with who he is, while in Wreck-It Ralph, it's Felix who basically repairs Calhoun's broken heart. And both women also have a brief falling out with said man, though in Megamind it's a lot more justified, while in Wreck-It Ralph it's more of a misunderstanding, with Felix completely unintentionally saying the absolute wrong thing to her. In other words, Roxanne ultimately forgiving Megamind is a much bigger plot point than Calhoun forgiving Felix, and the reasons for that should be pretty obvious. And speaking of Fix-It Felix Jr., both movies also have a traditional hero figure that doesn't turn out to be the real villain of the story. Though the difference between these two are a lot more glaring, as Felix ultimately plays a much bigger role in the plot of Wreck-It Ralph than Metro Man does in Megamind. I mean, sure, it is Metro Man's decision to fake his death that causes the events of the movie to happen in the first place, but that's about his only major contribution. But to go over the similarities first, both characters have a rivalry with the main character and quote-unquote villain that only goes skin deep, and are both pretty nice people when all's said and done. And they're both also beloved, respected, and just basically the idol of everybody around them. But even there's a crucial difference. Because while Felix is an extremely kind man that nonetheless appreciates all the love he's given, he never lets it go to his head and always remains the humble, unassuming hero that everybody sees him as. While Metro Man turns out to feel unfulfilled as a hero who just going through the motions basically and putting on an act for everyone, and even goes as far as to fake his death so he can find a true purpose in life. Now, as I argued in my aforementioned video, that's probably because he realized that the whole dynamic between him and Megamind is just one big act that serves absolutely no purpose, and desires to do something that'll actually make him feel like he's accomplishing something. And there's also the fact that while Felix is the only character in their game that treats Ralph nicely or with anything resembling respect, it takes him a while to truly understand him, while Metro Man seems to be the only person that actually understands Megamind throughout the entire movie. But I believe their differences go even deeper than that as well. Because while they're both interesting takes on the classic hero in what is ultimately a villain's story, I believe Wreck-It Ralph explored that concept better in this case. Because while Ralph is the main character, Felix isn't ignored and is allowed just as much time to shine, use his unique powers, and let his completely wholesome nature grow on the audience. In other words, just because the movie is Ralph's story doesn't mean that Felix still doesn't have an important part to play in it. While Metro Man barely has 10 minutes of screen time and doesn't contribute much, and if I could just inject my own opinion in here for a second, I honestly feel that's a real shame. Because Metro Man honestly had the potential to be a really interesting character, starting out as a brat who plays the hero because it gets him love and attention, only to mellow out over time and realize he'd rather have a true purpose than the glories of fame and fortune, while also coming to sympathize most with the man who's supposed to be his worst enemy. Like I said, there could have been a really interesting story there, but they didn't go anywhere with it. I mean, could you imagine what it would have been like for Metro Man and Megamind to team up at the movie's climax and defeat Titan together? And that's another thing about him. It was one thing to leave the city in the hands of Megamind, a man he knew wasn't any real danger or would hurt anyone, but to just sit back and let a real threat, and one that, no matter how indirectly, he had a role in creating, go on an actual rampage while actively making it clear he means to kill people? I'm sorry, but something about that just never sat right with me. And speaking of which, there's also the villains, both of whom have a massive plot twist involving them, are fallen heroes, and ultimately serve as a dark reflection of what the main character could have become if they had chosen to succumb to their mistreatment. But once again, in this instance, I'd say that these two are ultimately more different than the same. Because Hal Stewart being the villain is in and of itself the plot twist, while in the case of King Candy, it's his identity that's the much bigger twist, as it's clear from pretty early on that this guy's bad news. And on that topic, Titan is meant to come across as an unlikable, whiny man-child who lets his insane powers go to his head, and they are the only reason why he's a threat, as the moment Megamind removes them, he's easily defeated. Because in the end, he's not very smart. And King Candy is pretty much the complete opposite of that, being extremely intelligent, and while having petty motivations, definitely has that classic Disney villain charm to him. But they both nonetheless come across exactly the way they're supposed to and make for extremely effective villains. And in the end, that's really what's most important here. And of course, there are other minor players, such as the minion characters, who are honestly polar opposites of each other, but are still entertaining regardless, as well as mostly random characters who shun the main characters at first, but come to appreciate them towards the end after they prove their worth. Really, the only major character from either movie without a counterpart is Vanellope, and even then Roxanne does have some shades of her, but Vanellope ends up being a major reason for the two having many differences. Because in the end, it mostly comes down to the characters themselves and the presenting of a stereotypical villain in a sympathetic light that makes the two movies in any way similar. Ultimately, Megamind is a deconstruction of superhero movies, while Wreck-It Ralph is a complete love letter to retro and arcade-style gaming. One movie is about a villain learning that he can be the hero, and the other is a man learning that it's not a medal that makes somebody a true hero. And one even involves traveling through quite a few extremely different areas over the course of the story, while the other stays in pretty much the exact same locations throughout the entire runtime. So in essence, no. Wreck-It Ralph is most certainly not just a ripoff of Megamind, and even the similarities I listed between them are most likely coincidental. But even then, it still goes to show how two seemingly different movies can actually have quite a bit in common with each other, as well as through their differences demonstrate how each one could have looked had the writers taken a different approach to telling their respective stories. Though in this particular case, I feel that both movies are more or less perfect just the way they are, and wouldn't need much improvement anyway. Okay, I think that's all I've got on that. So now why don't you guys tell me? How much do you believe Wreck-It Ralph and Megamind have in common? Do you believe they have their fair share of similarities, or do you think any similarities between them is extremely superficial? Please let me know what you think in the comments. And as always, you don't have to agree with my opinions on this video. You can feel any way you want to about anything that was brought up here. And thank you all for watching. It is all very greatly appreciated. And I hope to see you all next time.